At the end of 2025, I put a post up on LinkedIn about what I thought were the contenders so far for the 5 speeches of the century. A quarter of the way through the 21st century, what were we beginning to look at in terms of the speeches that would have the biggest impact? If we look back at the 20th century, you'd be looking at your Martin Luther Kings, your JFKs. What would the equivalent be in this century? And of the 5, I think people were probably most surprised when I listed today's talk as one of those 5. Brene Brown's TED Talk in 2011, The Power of Vulnerability. And the reason why I picked this talk is because I think Brene's speech has really been the catalyst for a shift in how we view expressing ourselves as speakers and being on stage. Because before this time, when you look back at speaking in certainly the 20th century, and even the first decade of the 21st century, so much of it is about fake it till you make it, about how do you look confident, about how do you destroy your public speaking nerves. And what Brene's done with this talk and with her subsequent work is she really started this conversation about being open, being vulnerable, about sharing your flaws and struggles and challenges and inadequacies and insecurities and fears. That wasn't something that was really in the public speaking sphere before she came along. But since then, we have seen a massive shift. And of course, she's not the only one who's been a part of this movement, but I would certainly consider her one of the pioneers. And that's why I consider today's talk to be such an important one to look at. Because this is where so much of that new approach, and frankly, I would say better approach, comes from. So how did she do it? How did she make this impactful speech that has really captured the hearts and minds of people, that have got people to embrace and step into this idea of being vulnerable, not just in terms of public speaking, of course, that's the lens we're going to look at it today, but just in life in general? How did she do it? This is a hugely important speech. As I said, I consider it to be one of the most important speeches of this century. How do we break down what Brene did and what impact she's had with this speech? We're going to be looking at the footage today provided by TED. I do not own the rights to this footage. The use of this footage is for informational and educational purposes only. And there is so much to learn from Brene Brown's speech, The Power of Vulnerability.
But I'm afraid if I call your researcher, no one will come because they'll think you're boring and irrelevant. And
Brene Brown here starts with self-deprecating humor. And this is a different approach and take to what we were seeing in the speaking realm at this particular time. What so much of the speaking philosophy was in the 20th century, and again, even in the beginning of the 21st century, as I said, it's all about coming up onto stage, establishing your authority, demonstrating that you're an expert, building credibility. And one of the first things that Brene Brown says is, this is why I could be boring and irrelevant. This is why I'm not an authority, not an expert, don't have credibility. And this is a really counterintuitive approach, but it's so much of the basis of Brene Brown's approach and style as a speaker, and so much of the philosophy that she's talking about and building right here at this moment in time in the speaking sphere. She's using self-deprecating humor to take herself off a pedestal and try and establish more of that equal plane and equal basis with the audience of, I'm not talking to you from the heights up here. I'm talking to you as a person, level to level, face to face, heart to heart. And she uses this self-deprecating humor to be able to bring herself off that pedestal and build that relatability and build that connection with her audience.
you're a storyteller, so I think what I'll do is just call you a storyteller. And of course, the academic, insecure part of me was like, you're going to call me a what? And she said, I'm going to call you a storyteller.
So here again, we see some self-deprecating humor, but it's almost in the opposite vein to what we've just seen. So Brene Brown began by taking herself off a pedestal, I'm boring and irrelevant. But here she's kind of pluffing herself up and saying, no, I'm an academic, I'm a researcher, I need to be taken very, very seriously. I cannot be called a storyteller. So she's almost like plumping herself up with false bravado. But again, it's self-deprecation from the opposite lens of she's putting on this persona of someone who is putting them on a pedestal, who is trying to be seen seriously and to take themselves seriously. But she's doing it in this mocking way of mocking herself. And again, it's bringing her down to earth, making her more relatable, building that connection with the audience. So we're in the first 60 seconds of the speech here, and we're not actually getting into topic matter at all. What Brene Brown is doing is she's trying to establish this level playing field and this open relationship with her audience. And this is something that really encapsulates her style. And you can see this with a little bit of a follow-up that comes next. Watch this.
And I was like, oh, why not Magic Pixie? I was like,
So if you ask any stand-up comedian, they'll say that comedy comes in 3 parts. So you've got the setup, you've got the punchline, and then you've got the follow-up. And what we can see is that actually Brene Brown has used that pattern. When the first minute of her speech, and all she's doing at the moment is telling jokes. And she's telling jokes at her expense. And this one she's going, look, like what's the point? I might as well just be a magic pixie at this point. I'm not being taken seriously. I'm not an academic. I'm not a researcher. So this 3-part formula is so key because she's not trying to introduce the subject matter to her audience. She's trying to build the relationship first. And for those of you who've seen some of my other material, or you've been on some of my webinars, you've heard me perhaps speak about the 4 speaking styles. And if we look at the Queen speaking style, and well done if you can nerd out and remember the Queen style, the Queen style of speaker is all about building relationships, building connection with the audience. And the archetype model that I always hold up for the Queen style is Brene Brown. I always say, if you want to see what the Queen style looks like in action, go and watch Brene Brown, and honestly in particular, go and watch this exact speech, because you'll see that what she's prioritizing here is not about trying to establish herself as an expert, is not trying to show how mind-blowing her research is not trying to get the audience to do something, take action, here's what you need to do. She's prioritizing the relationship first. She's setting the relationship. The relationship is like the soil that the seeds are going to be planted in. And Brene Brown knows that if she builds the relationship with the audience first, the ideas that she shares are more likely to be taken on, more likely to be implemented. And that's why she's focusing all at the beginning of this speech on taking herself off a pedestal, making herself relatable, making herself someone that the audience they feel that they can trust, and if they like and trust you, they're going to follow what you say. Brene Brown really understands the dynamics of how you build a relationship with the audience. And again, at this moment in time, in 2011, this was not common practice. It's not common practice nowadays, and it certainly wasn't 14 years ago. But she was one of the pioneers of understanding that if you are going to really get an audience to do something, to follow you, to implement something, you build that relationship first. And you build that relationship by taking yourself off a pedestal, making yourself human, making yourself relatable, making the audience feel like you are a friend and partner who they're speaking to. And that makes the audience receptive to the lessons that you share.
And I'm going to talk to you today. We're talking about expanding perception. And so I want to talk to you and tell some stories about a piece of my research that fundamentally expanded my perception and really actually changed the way that I live and love and work and parent.
What we've got here is the Tellem structure. The Tellem structure is falsely attributed to Winston Churchill, and he never actually really did this, but for a speech, you begin your speech by telling them what you're going to tell them. The middle of your speech, you tell them the thing. The end of your speech, you tell them what you just told them. And it's quite a basic structure for a speech, and it's fine for someone who's getting into speaking and they need a little bit of structure, and they need something to build their speech around. It's not something that I'm particularly a fan of. I don't like seeing it in speeches. I think it's quite a formulaic way of speaking. There's much more interesting and engaging ways to structure your speech. However, all that being said, this reads a lot better here because Brene Brown started with that anecdote. Or, well, an anecdote is the correct word. I need to stop doubting myself. So she begins with this anecdote. She begins with that humor. She builds that relationship. And now we're a minute 30 in. And this tellum, it doesn't grate so badly on me as someone who isn't particularly a fan of it, because she's built some relationship and connection first. Whereas a mistake that I see in a lot of TED speeches, even well-viewed and well-regarded speeches, is a speaker comes in and they just start with the tellum. They come onto stage and they say, this is what I'm going to tell you. And it isn't building that relationship with the audience, isn't sparking their curiosity, isn't making them excited for what's to come next. So although I'm not a huge fan of doing it, it's much better employed at this part of the speech because Brene Brown has done some more of the engagement. She's done more of that relationship building at the beginning. She's had that more emotional start. Now this little bit of logic that comes in, this is what we're going to cover next, is better placed at this moment in the speech.
Because I am interested in some messy topics, but I want to be able to make them not messy. I want to understand them. I want to hack into these things that I know are important and lay the code out for everyone to see.
Do you see that intense eye contact from Brene Brown? She's speaking and she's talking and she keeps speaking and she keeps looking. She's looking at one person and then she moves. That intense eye contact is a really powerful relationship builder. And something that you'll see a lot of speakers try and do, and even speakers who are relatively experienced, is they try to divide their eye contact across all of their audience. I've got to look at you, I've got to look at you, I've got to look at you, I've got to look at you. Because it feels like that's what you need to do to make all of your audience feel seen and feel attended to. And there's a little bit of counterintuitive thinking here. When you find one audience member and you give them that intense connection, that intense eye contact, it makes that audience member feel really seen and recognized. But what it does for the other audience members is they spot how much you're paying attention to that one person. They go, wow, this is someone who really pays attention to someone when they're speaking to them. So even if you aren't looking at someone else, people see how much individual connection you're giving to one person, that intensity of connection, and it's like this ripple effect that goes through them. So it's this little bit of counterintuitive thinking that if you want to build a connection with your audience, you don't scatter your gaze all over them because it'll make everyone feel like they're being given superficial, distracted, short attention. You find people in different parts of the audience, give them more engaged eye contact and focus. And paradoxically, that makes everyone feel like you're giving them that intense focus. And if you've got a long enough speech, you're going to be able to get around a good number of members of the audience. So don't feel, oh, I'm going to look at like 3 people in this whole speech and everyone's going to feel left out. No, that's not the way that it works. So again, this is one of the techniques and skills that Brene Brown really understands in terms of building that relationship and building that connection. She knows that the way you build that relationship and connection, paradoxically, is not to try and spread it across everyone in a scattergun fashion. It's trying to find that intense, individualized connection because the audience see that intense connection you give to one person and makes them feel like when you're speaking to them, you're going to give them that intense, individualized connection as well.
Well, you know that situation where you get an evaluation from your boss and she tells you 37 things that you do really awesome and one thing that you can't, an opportunity for growth.
Brene uses a relatable scenario here, and she starts off by using the words, you know when. You know when, and the power of that is the audience do know when. So you're getting a review, someone says loads of good things about you, but they say one thing that is perceived as negative. And Brene Brown, again, she has a little bit of a joke here that this negative thing, it's always kind of innuendo. There's always innuendo or euphemism around it of, yeah, it's an opportunity for growth. Sure, it might be an opportunity for growth, but we perceive it as a slight, don't we? And you can hear the audience laugh at that. So there's this little in-joke, and Brene Brown knows it's an in-joke. That's why she starts off with the phrase, you know when, because she knows it's going to be relatable to the audience. She knows the audience are going to see it in themselves. And when she does the opportunity for growth, that's when the punchline of the in-joke is revealed. Everyone sits there and they go, yeah, I have been in that exact situation. So it's a really great bit of connection and relatability from Brene Brown. She's using an anecdote that people will see themselves in. And this is such a critical part of speaking, that when you're delivering a speech, you don't want the audience to go, yeah, okay, so this is Brene's story and this is Brene's speech. What you really want the audience to do is go, wow, that's me. Brene's story is mine. Because you are delivering a speech, so the audience can see themselves in your speech. They can see their experience, their struggles, their aspiration. Because if they see themselves in your speech and you are showing them a journey and a process to change, to improve, to overcome challenges, to reach aspirations, if they see themselves in that journey and that process, they will believe they have the ability to do it too. If they don't see themselves in that journey and process, they'll go, okay, it worked for them, but it won't work for me. There will be no belief in that. The more you can get your audience to see themselves in your speech, the more impact you're going to have on their lives.
Well, apparently this is the way my work went as well, because when you ask people about love, they tell you about heartbreak. When you ask people about belonging, they'll tell you their most excruciating experiences of being excluded. And when you ask people about connection, the stories they told me were about disconnection.
Whew, mega nerd points from Brene Brown right here. There is so much going on. First of all, we have our classic rule of three. Brene Brown says 3 things. We have a special type of repetition called anaphora. Anaphora, the way to remember it is anaphora, at the start. We have when you ask about love, when you ask about belonging, when you ask about connection. Then we have juxtaposition. So when you ask about love, you get heartbreak. When you ask about connection, you get disconnection. So there is so much wrapped up in there. I often talk on these analysis videos about the synergy of techniques. That we have this different toolbox of techniques that we can use, and we can fire out rule of 3 until we get blue in the face. But are there ways to really put that double underline on things? And that's what we see here. Brene is combining 3 different techniques to make her point. That when we're asking people about positive aspects of relationships and interactions, we're often getting stories about the negative. Why is that? And basically what she's trying to do, bringing all this attention to those points with these multiple techniques, is that's a really important thing that we need to investigate and understand, is why does that happen? And that's what techniques do. All that techniques are doing, all that they're doing, is they're drawing your audience's attention to things. They're making them think about those things more intensely, and they'll help them to remember those things better. What Brene Brown wants the audience to do here is she wants them to start thinking about why people will share their negative experiences when they're asked about positive stuff. And then she also wants them to remember what is her research and what is her findings about this afterwards. And that's going to be the rest of her speech. So that's a really important seed that she's planting. She really wants that part of the speech to be remembered and thought about and processed and ultimately taken away from her speech. So she uses that multiple techniques to really highlight it and ingrain it in the audience's mind.
Empathy or connection. No one wants to talk about it, and the less you talk about it, the more you have it.
That's such a powerful line. The less you talk about it, the more you have it. Again, we're seeing that juxtaposition here. We're seeing this contrast of opposites. We were just talking about that in terms of that rule of 3 anaphora that she used. Juxtaposition, it helps people to weigh up, here is a reality and here's an aspiration. Because the aspiration is that we don't want people to have shame and fear. But the reality is that they do. And what's the reality? The reality is that, well, people don't want to talk about it, and the less they talk about it, the more they have it. So this is setting the foundation and seeds for, well, what's our aspiration? Well, our aspiration is we want people to not have shame and fear. Ergo, what do we need to do? We need to do the opposite of what's establishing the status quo at this moment. Whenever you are speaking, you're talking about change. No one comes up onto stage with a speech and says, do exactly what you're doing right now. Perfect. Right? Have you ever seen a speech like that? You know what? You don't need my diet plan. You are shredded as hell. You know what? You don't need to learn any public speaking skills. You are a master communicator. You never see a speech like that. Every single speech is about change. And the way that you get people to change is you show them why the status quo isn't working. And the use of juxtaposition helps the audience to see why the status quo isn't working, and most importantly, leads them towards why we need to do this thing instead. And that's what Brene Brown is saying here. She's saying, what we're doing now, not talking about shame and fear, is not working. We need to do this thing instead. We need to start talking about shame and fear.
So I was ready, and I was really excited.
I like this. So Brene Brown has this gesture, this really strong gesture. I was ready, I was excited. And what I love about this, it's a strong gesture, it's really expressive, but it's not over the top. When people are looking at speaking and looking at speeches and they start learning about body language, there can be an overcompensation that happens of people are very unexpressive with their body language, and they go, well, I need to be more expressive in my body language, so I need to do all this over the top, over dramatic stuff. And that's just as grating, if not more so, than the non-expressive body language. And what I loved about this moment of Brene Brown, she goes, yes, I'm ready. And it was expressive, but it was also natural. She didn't go, yes, I'm ready. It wasn't an over-egged thing. It was just in that sweet spot. It was in that sweet spot of being expressive, genuine, authentic, which is some of the keystone messaging of Brene Brown, of being authentic, being genuine. And I think that's really coming forward. She's walking the talk. She's practicing what she preaches. That was something that was really authentic, genuine, natural, expressive, but in the sweet spot of not being over the top with it. When we talk about body language, gestures, expressions, movement, all the other stuff, it's about finding that sweet spot. It's about learning how to bring that expressiveness onto stage, but not over-egging the expressiveness because someone told you you need to do body language on stage.
As you know, it's not going to turn out well.
As you know, it's not going to turn out well. So I love this little bit of self-awareness. It's almost a bit of TED memeing. Before TED memeing was necessarily a thing, TED is somewhat accused nowadays of having a bit of a formulaic structure to it, in terms of someone will say, this is what I thought about the world, then I went on a journey and realized that wasn't true, and now this is what I've learned, what I've actually thought of the world. It's not that that's a bad structure to have, but with the popularity of TED and the amount of speeches that are there, you are maybe seeing a certain success formula being followed. And what I like about this moment is it's probably memeing that before it necessarily became a meme. That TED at this point is popular, but it's not this kind of zeitgeist in the way that it'll be probably even just in like 2 or 3 years time after this. We're looking at Brene Brown's speech in 2011. So she's kind of gotten ahead of the meme culture with this. It's this lovely bit of self-awareness of, la la la, I think life was wonderful. And instead of saying, but then I discovered things weren't the case, she sort of gives away the punchline and says, well, yeah, you know what's coming, it's not going to work out. Now, normally I'd say that in speeches, you don't want to give away the punchline. You want to have that curiosity. You want to have that suspense. But suspense only works when the audience don't know what's going to happen. The audience here are clued on enough to know, look, she wouldn't be sharing this story if it wasn't all going to hit the fan quite quickly. So instead of keeping up this fake pretense, this fake suspense that isn't actually there, Brene Brown just breaks it instantly and says, yeah, I know that you know that things aren't going to go well from here. So I love this little, it's memeing before the meme even exists. It's this nice bit of self-awareness. It's almost that bit of self-deprecation again of, yeah, like here's me position myself as the expert and guess what? Things aren't going to work out because I don't know as much as I think I do. So some really nice self-awareness, nice bit of humor, and a little bit of memeing. The speech can be nice with a meme or two.
What they had in common was a sense of courage.
Ding, ding, ding! We have a lovely rule of three again. And not only do we have a rule of three, we have an alliteration rule of three. Now, the letter C is one of my favorite letters when it comes to using alliteration in speeches because there are so many good words that begin with C. C and P are amazing. There's so many topic-specific words, industry-specific words that work for those letters. Glad to see Brene using them here. We've talked about the rule of three, we've talked about alliteration. You use these to bring people's attention, to make it more memorable. So I'm not going to overdo it here, but what we can see again is that combining of techniques. We're going to talk about three things, and not just three things that begin with the same letter. So it draws more attention to them, so you remember them better, and if you remember them better, you will implement them better.
Courage to be imperfect. They had the compassion.
Courage to be imperfect. That pause lets that line sink in. Brene Brown really wants the audience to take away that message. You have to have the courage to be imperfect. And she knows that's an uncomfortable, difficult truth to process. So she puts in this uncomfortable pause where the audience need to process and take that on. Because if she shares this uncomfortable truth and then she speeds past it, you're giving the audience permission to move on and speed past it themselves. But when you have a key statement, when there's something that you want the audience to take on, process, and have sink in, and especially if that's something uncomfortable, don't give them an out. Don't let them escape it and move on to something else and think about it. Give them the uncomfortable silence to process the uncomfortable truth, to help them push past that discomfort into the desired result.
Fully embraced vulnerability. They believed that what made them vulnerable made them beautiful. They didn't talk about...
So you see the exact same thing happens again. What made them vulnerable made them beautiful. Brene Brown really wants these key messages to sink in, and she gives those messages space, processing time for the audience to digest them. When you get to the key messages of your speech, do not rush through them. Do not allow the audience to lose concentration, lose awareness, to feel uncomfortable, move on. Give your key messages time to breathe, time to settle, and time for the audience to take them on.
Because about 5 of my friends are like, woo, I wouldn't want to be your therapist.
So here we see more self-deprecating humor. So we've talked about this earlier in the speech, so I'm not going to harp on about it too much. But again, Brene Brown started a speech with self-deprecating humor, take her off a pedestal a little bit. Then she came in with these research findings and presented herself as an expert, as a guru, like here's what I found, here's what I've discovered, here's these really important fundamental lessons that I know and you don't, and I want you to take on. So she kind of went back onto the pedestal again. So there's this awareness of, okay, I've gone back onto the pedestal, I don't want to stay there and keep on lecturing from there. She takes herself off the pedestal again. I wouldn't want to be your therapist. It's more self-deprecating humor. Here's the really key part of self-deprecating humor, is that I see a lot of speakers forget the humor part of it. Then they're just self-deprecating. They say, I'm rubbish, I'm worthless, you shouldn't listen to me, why are you even here? No, you've still got to be the expert. You've still got to be someone who has something of value to share and believe that the audience can benefit from what you've got to share. So we're not self-deprecating ourselves and saying we're worthless and useless. But what we've got to recognize is that we aren't putting ourselves on this lofty plane where the audience feel that they can't reach, feel that they can't get up to us. And that awareness of, okay, well, sometimes I do need to step up, step into that role of expert, step into that role of leader, step into that role of guide, because there is that element of authority, expertise, credibility that I do need to impart if I'm to help you change something, if I'm going to help you implement something. But you don't stay up there all the time. You need to have that relatability. And that relatability comes from the self-deprecation, but self-deprecation in a positive, friendly way, and not in a way that you're just putting yourself down and saying, look, don't even bother listening to me. You've wasted your time coming here. It's a fine balance to get, and it's real confidence and a little bit of courage as well that allows you to get that balance between being self-deprecating in a positive, humorous way that builds that relatability and connection, and in that way that no doubt your speech and nobody's going to want to listen to you anymore.
I need some help. And I said, but here's the thing. No family stuff, no childhood shit.
There is this rule or perceived rule in speaking that you're not allowed to swear. Swearing's bad. Language is language. All words have meaning and all words have a use. And I actually love a swear in a speech. Now, especially if you're in a room full of adults, like everyone, I'm not going to say everyone there is an adult because that's probably not true, but most people there are an adult. And honestly, if you're speaking to an adult audience and you use a bit of adult language, that for me is fine, it's appropriate, it's applicable. This is one of the most watched TED Talks of all time. It's one of the most impactful speeches, in my opinion, in this century. Brene Brown says shit. That did not stop her speech from being one of the most viewed talks of all time, being one of the most impactful speeches of all time. Because again, when we're talking about having that relatability, having that commonality, when you talk like people talk, it makes you relatable. And let's face it, people fucking swear, right? In everyday conversation, people swear. The majority of people do. Some people swear off swearing, and that's absolutely fine. And that's great and virtuous, and you're a better person than me if you don't swear. But understanding when swearing is appropriate. Now, if Brene Brown comes up on there and she's fucking and shitting and she's dropping a C-bomb here and there, like, unless you're doing some late night stand-up, that's probably not appropriate. And honestly, even if you are doing late night stand-up, that's maybe not exactly the most clever use of language either. But honestly, you throw in the odd swear word here and there, you're not going to get crucified. You're not going to get struck by lightning. Your audience aren't going to throw tomatoes at you. If anything, I believe it does make you look more relatable when you speak like people speak. Be aware of context. Be aware of who you're speaking to, of course, and be appropriate with the use of language. And if you do drop a swear word, don't use it gratuitously. Use it in a way that adds to the speech. And you can see when Brene Brown says no childhood shit there, it gets a massive laugh. And the reason why it gets a massive laugh is because there's the meme about working with a therapist and you have to talk about your childhood. And Brene Brown is caricaturing that. She's making a meme out of that. She's making a joke out of that. And that's why people laugh. Honestly, if she said like, no childhood stuff, the audience probably still would have laughed. But just that little bit of shock factor of no childhood shit, it's more human, it's more relatable, because many of the audience, I'm sure, if they were going to therapy, that's what they would be saying. They wouldn't say, excuse me, kind sir, or excuse me, kind ma'am. Please could we refrain from not covering topics relating to matters in my life before the age of 18. Thank you, kind regards, sincerely. No, people would say, look, I don't want to talk about my fucking childhood, all right? That's how people actually think, and that's how people actually respond. And Brene Brown is putting a voice to real people's thoughts and real people's language. And that is where you get their relatability, and that is where you get the connection.
Why do we struggle with it so much? Am I alone in struggling with vulnerability? No. So this is what I learned.
What we see here is quite a bold technique from Brene. She asks a direct question, am I alone? And it's got a little bit of a rhetorical factor to it. And I think a lot of people in their TED Talks would use that in a more rhetorical way. Am I alone? And then you almost answer it yourself. Brene actually goes for the direct question, and you can see she opens her hands and she holds, "Am I alone?" And she has the courage to hold that space to invite the audience, look, I actually want you to respond here. TED Talks aren't necessarily the place where you expect that type of interaction, that calling out and that open conversation. It's not like a more closed training environment where there's more interaction, there's more questions, there's more exercises, you're doing things on a flip chart. So to actually have a direct question and want to elicit that response is bold. You'll notice that Brene does this 14 minutes into a TED speech. She doesn't come up onto stage and say, "Hey, I want you to answer a question," shout out loud. No, she establishes this foundation. She builds this relationship. She builds this rapport. And then when she asks the question, you can see, even after all that relationship work, she doesn't get the interaction immediately. She has to hold the space and invite it, and then she gets it. But she's built enough of a relationship and foundation at that point where she is going to get it. She has to work for it, but she trusts herself that she's done enough groundwork up until that point where if she does ask a direct question, she is going to get that interaction. So it's bold from Brene, but it's also so much of what she does is this element of boldness. Boldness comes from courage, and it comes from vulnerability, because it's vulnerable to ask a direct question and wait for an interaction, because it might fuck up and nobody says anything. So it's much easier to ask a rhetorical question and not need to have an answer, because you don't get that kind of social awkwardness of, I've asked a question and nobody's answered it. If you just make it rhetorical, am I alone here? No, I'm not alone here. But to actually want that interaction, you're making yourself vulnerable. So again, Brene Brown is walking the talk, practicing what she's preaching. She's talking about a topic of vulnerability, and she's demonstrating boldness, courage, and vulnerability in this speech.
Initiating sex with my wife, being turned down, asking someone out.
I'm going to do a little bit of inside baseball here. When Brene talks about doing this speech, she talks about this setup that she's in. And again, remember, this is a TEDx speech. So this is one of those kind of smaller, more independent events. There's a classic example that I've covered on the channel already of Simon Sinek, who had this very kind of amateurish looking setup. He had a microphone that didn't work. He had a dodgy flip chart. The lighting and camera was poor. And you can see that Brene's got a bit more of that kind of setup here. But one of the things that she talks about when she talks about this speech was that the lighting crew initially had the lights up. And she said, I'm standing on stage and I can't see anyone in the audience. If I can't see anyone in the audience, how am I going to build this connection, the rapport with them? So she actually asked them to put the lights down so that she could see the audience. And you'll see how often she employs this technique of, we talked about the intense eye contact earlier. So she's making that eye contact, and when she's looking out there, she's not just looking out at this kind of hazy, kind of spotty light darkness. No, she's able to look at and see someone's actual face here. So you can see the dynamics of that you can see that the stage actually isn't that brightly lit. You can see it's like a little bit grainy and a little bit dark. And that was a deliberate choice from Brene. And it's one of these kind of like inside nerdy micro details that you wouldn't necessarily think of. But I love it because it's the attention to detail. It's those small 1%ers that make a huge difference when you add them together. Brene Brown, her entire sort of ethos and her strength and her focus is, I need to build that connection. I need to build that rapport. I need to build that relationship. And if that means that I look a little bit more washed out on camera, that's fine. Because what matters is not if I look a little bit washed out on camera or the stage doesn't look as professional and nicely lit as it could do. If I've had the opportunity to build that connection, build that rapport, and set that fertile soil for my ideas to land on, that is a far more important thing to me.
Here's fear, here's disappointment. I don't want to feel these. I'm going to have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. I don't want to feel these.
Here we see a different style of humor from Brene Brown. A lot of her humor so far has been quite self-deprecating, quite sort of like in on the joke, very playful. She's laughed at herself, she's poked fun. Here we see kind of like a deadpan serious of like, I'm just gonna have a beer and a banana and a muffin. And we've got this seriousness, and she holds that seriousness and deadpan, even as the audience is laughing. So it's this nice twist on the humorous styles. And what we see here is that although she's telling a joke, by having the serious expression, she's going, yeah, this is funny, but yeah, this is how we act in real life. When we say this in real life, I'm going to have a beer and a muffin, we're not saying that as a joke. We're saying that because we seriously want to push down and hide from those uncomfortable emotions. A lot of truth is said in jest. A lot of truth is said in jest. And here with the deadpan expression, Brene Brown shows the serious expression and the audience laugh. But they're laughing because they know, oh shit, yeah, that's exactly how I act. And that's why Brene Brown chooses the deadpan serious expression for this moment, because she's going, look, don't laugh, haha, point fun at myself. We need to reveal this uncomfortable truth that we suppress things that we're uncomfortable with.
And then we feel vulnerable, so then we have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. And it becomes this dangerous cycle.
You see here the callback. So she tells the uncomfortable truth, she explains it, then she makes the callback to it. Then she makes the reference. So this is often used as a comedic technique of, remember that joke I told earlier? Ha 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 ha. Well, here's me building on it. So here we see, it's almost in reverse, that actually she told it as a joke first, but when she calls back to it, it's a more serious point. She's not making the callback to try and squeeze the juice and get the extra laugh. No, she's making the callback to reiterate the serious nature of it. The first time it came out as a joke and a punchline and people laughed and it got their attention. But after people laugh, they listen. And what Brene Brown has done is she's got people to laugh, so they're going to listen to this point, and then she reminds them about the seriousness of the point. Yes, you laughed earlier, but there's a serious message behind this. So using a comedic technique, but almost using it in a non-comedic way, finding a new way to implement the technique, get people's attention, and get them to process and think about an important point she's made.
Can I love you this much? Can I believe in this as passionately? Can I be this fierce about this? Just to be able to stop and instead of catastrophe.
Here we see the rule of three again. Can. I'm not going to badger on about rule of three anymore. We know why the rule of three is used. It's drawing people's attention. It's making it more memorable. And here at the end, Brene Brown is starting to go into leadership, into direction, into guidance and suggestions. So the reason why she's drawing people's attention to this now, the reason why she's making it more memorable, is not to get them to think and process about the status quo, about their lives. Now it's more about like, this is what you need to do. This is the next step. This is the direction to go down. We've covered these uncomfortable truths. We looked at the status quo. And if you want to continue to grow and improve and reach for those aspirations and overcome these setbacks and obstacles, these are the steps. Remember these steps. And I'm going to make them memorable for you by delivering them in a memorable way. What we've been looking at so far is what I consider to be one of the most impactful speeches of this century so far. And that is the power and opportunity that you have when you step into that big red circle. What you say in that circle matters. What you say during that 80 minutes or less that you're granted in it extends for so much more time beyond that. How do you make the most of it? How are you able to make the most of that opportunity in the big red circle that many of the most impactful speakers of this century have been able to do? Well, this is what I share with you in my TEDx masterclass. So this was a masterclass that I delivered at one of the TEDx events that I've coached here in Scotland. It's an hour long, covering the 5 key principles of what makes a successful TED Talk. And you can have access to this masterclass for free, all as part of your ongoing continuous public speaking and TEDx education. To access the recording of this masterclass, I've put the link in the video description below. Just click that link, Sign up, it's free, no credit card details, and you get an hour's masterclass to help you one day step into that red circle and make the most of it, just like Brene Brown did. Now, if I was to speak to Brene Brown and she was wanting to add another TED Talk to her extensive collection, and she wanted to think about how do I continue to grow and improve in my speaking, what should I do? Well, here's what I would share with her. And here's what I'm going to share with you too.
So I'll start with this. A couple of years ago,
So I'll start with this. It's one of those redundant phrases that you don't need. What you say first is what you're starting with. So it doesn't need to be explained, this is what I'm going to start with, because the first word's out your mouth. One year I was at a talk, there you go. That is what you started with. So there's often these little filler phrases that come in. This one's not necessary. It's more powerful just to dive straight into the story and get the audience along for the ride.
and divided them into people who really have a sense of worthiness. That's what this comes down to, a sense of worthiness. They have a strong sense of love and belonging. And folks who struggle for it, and folks who are always wondering if they're good enough. There was only one variable that separated the people who had a strong sense of love and belonging and the people who really struggle.
So this is some really bad filming that goes on. It cuts to slide, it cuts back to Brene, it kind of lags and cuts back to a slide. You'll see like as this goes on.
And that was the people who have a strong sense of love and
there's this sort of like lag. But what I wanted to draw attention to is what I hope you spotted in the middle. Brene talks about these two groups of people. She talks about those who feel worthy, those who don't. And she's making a bit of a demarcation between them. And I just wanted that demarcation to be a bit more clear, either with her gestures or indeed with her use of the stage. So she does this sort of thing. And you can see that they're in two pots, but they're kind of occupying the same general space over here. So what I would encourage Brene to do is either put these groups on separate parts of the stage. So you can move to one side of the stage and there was this one group here who didn't feel worthy. There was this other group here who did feel worthy. So you get this really clear distinction between the two. Or at the very least, just make that more pronounced with her gestures. So don't do a demarcation like this. Do a demarcation like this. You've got one clear group here, one clear group here. You point to this group when you talk about them, you point to this group when you talk about them. This was just a little close here. And in terms of visuals, you want your audience to be following along visually with what you're doing, because we encode things and we process things so much through our visuals. Even when we're thinking about things, we're imagining them in our mind's eye. So make that visual distinction clearer for the audience to make that processing smoother for them.
Is what it is. And I said, oh my God, this is gonna suck.
Brene Brown has a crutch or a filler, what we would call it in Toastmasters. She says and a lot. She'll make a point, she'll tell a joke. Now here's where I disagree with Toastmasters to some extent. In Toastmasters, for those of you who are Toastmasters, you know that at Toastmasters meeting, we have this row called the R counter. And the R counter sits there and they count how many as you do, how many crutch phrases you know, so, okay, like. And if you're using these things a lot, it can definitely be distracting. It can upset the flow of your speech. It can get irritating for your audience. But here's where I disagree with it a little, because there are really successful speakers who do this all the time. And in everyday conversation, we do this all the time. When we're chatting with friends, we have hesitations and fillers and crutch phrases all of the time. It's the normal process of how we speak. And this idea of creating these smooth, perfect robots that never have these crutches and filler phrases, I'm in two minds about, because you want to get it away to the point that it's a distraction. But honestly, there's still some speakers who do it all the time. So Simon Sinek does it all the time. Barack Obama does it all the time. Brene Brown does it all the time. So I'm not going to stand here with my little R counter through this TED Talk and count how many times Brene Brown R's and ums, because honestly, she does it a lot. I would imagine it's maybe up in the sort of 40s or 50s over an 18-minute speech. Like, that's a lot. But it's still one of the most watched speeches of all time, and it's still one of the most impactful speeches of all time. So has that stopped it being a good speech? Well, no, of course it hasn't. But what I would be looking at is thinking about the optimization of that. And one tendency that I notice with Brene Brown's ums, she does it at the end of a thought, and she does it at the end of a punchline. Now, the issue is that when you tell the punchline, you want to give that punchline a bit of breathing time, because sometimes people don't see the humor straight away. It takes a couple seconds to process things. So if you right after you've delivered the punchline, the audience is now no longer processing what you just said. They're processing the and going, what does mean? So Brene in this speech has the tendency to just step on her punchlines a little bit, rather than tell the punchline, hold the silence, and let that humor build. And she uses the pause fantastically elsewhere in her speech. I talked about that earlier in the video. So she can use the pause, she can use it to great effect. I just want her to be bringing that in and being more mindful of when she has these little fillers, and be mindful of not doing them when she just told a punchline. Let that silence do the work, let that humor build, and get the full juice out of her punchlines.
Then we stop screaming and start listening. We're kinder and gentler to the people around us, and we're kinder and gentler to ourselves. That's all I have.
So, right at the end, the very last thing Brene Brown says is, that's all I have. And it's just a little bit of a damp squid of an end. You want your last line to finish on a flourish. You want to send the audience away with something. You want that key thought, that key idea, that key action, that key message to be ringing through. Your last line lingers with your audience. They'll kind of forget what you said 60 seconds before that, but they'll remember the last thing. Don't make the last thing they remember be, and that's all I have. I think Brene had a fantastic opportunity and a fantastic setup for her last line. In these last 60 to 30 seconds, she's talking about this idea of worthiness. She brings up this slide with this picture, I am enough, talking about this importance of seeing ourselves as I am enough. And I think a fantastic way to end a speech would be, and I know sometimes that we don't always feel that I am enough, and our self-image and our beliefs and our doubts and insecurities can really get in the way. And sometimes it can be difficult to find that place for ourselves. But I want to tell you today, in case you need to hear it, you are enough. I'm out of here. One of the best TED Talks of all time, baby. I'm going to be talked about for years afterwards. That's the finish that I wanted to see. So that would have been a much more powerful end. It would have tied in so much better with this conclusion that she's building up, rather than taking us up and dribbling away right at the end. Take us up and send us higher, baby. I've loved evaluating this speech. It's probably one of the hardest speeches that I've found to evaluate, in terms of picking out, okay, well, what could you do to make this speech better? Because as I said, it's been such an impactful speech. It's really hit the zeitgeist. I think in particular for women who are speakers as well, what Brene Brown is speaking about has really been giving them permission to be vulnerable, to be authentic, to be genuine. And by the way, it's also given men permission to be as well, because men have felt this need to be a certain way and project this certain image, and women have felt that in order to compete in male-dominated industries, they needed to be as hard or harder than the men. But what Brene Brown has done is she's opened up these avenues and saying, this is not the best way to connect. It's not the best way to communicate. We communicate and we connect best, not by showing how strong we are, but by showing our flaws, showing our failures, showing that vulnerability, because then we can take the audience on a journey. If the audience don't connect with us, you can have the best research in the world, you can have the most cutting edge strategies, but if your audience don't connect with you as a person, they're not going to listen to you, they're not going to follow you, they're not going to be impacted by you. And Brene Brown has been liked followed, and impacted by so many people around the world. And that's what you want to do with a speech. And that's what's possible when you get a TED Talk right, the way that Brene did with this one.